In the autumn of 1700, Europe's most powerful throne was held by a man whose body was essentially a walking corpse. Charles II of Spain, the last ruler of the Habsburg dynasty, endured his final months in such a horrifying state that his own courtiers whispered he was possessed by evil spirits. What they witnessed in those last days would forever haunt European history, as a centuries-old dynasty collapsed alongside the decaying body of its last heir. Charles II's death would not only mark the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, but also ignite a devastating war that would reshape the continent's balance of power for generations to come. Yet the true horror lay not in the political aftermath, but in the grotesque spectacle of a man slowly falling apart, while frantic courtiers resorted to increasingly savage rituals to save their king and empire. This is the story of how centuries of royal inbreeding created a living nightmare of suffering, and how one man's agonizing final days altered the course of world history. The medical documents and eyewitness testimonies from Charles's deathbed reveal a scene so disturbing that many historians have struggled to fully convey his torment. What follows is not just the tale of a monarch's death, but a warning about the catastrophic effects of absolute power tainted by genetic disaster. The desperate efforts of the Spanish court to heal their dying king exposed the darkest aspects of 17th century medicine and superstition. For over 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty governed one of the largest empires in the world, controlling vast lands from the Americas to the Philippines. By the late 1600s, Spain remained a formidable empire. But cracks were emerging both within the realm and its royal family. The Habsburgs had long engaged in strategic intermarriage, convinced it would preserve their pure bloodline and consolidate their power. Charles II, born in 1661, was the result of generations of this intentional inbreeding. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins, and the pattern of close-kin marriages extended back to his great-grandparents. By Charles's conception, the Habsburg family tree had become so entangled that his inbreeding coefficient exceeded that of children born to siblings. The Spanish court was well aware that their royal lineage was producing increasingly fragile heirs. Charles's elder brother, Philip Prospero, had died at just 4 years old, and several other potential successors had perished in infancy or early childhood. Immense pressure rested on Charles to survive and produce an heir, as the continuation of Habsburg rule in Spain hinged entirely on him. From birth, Charles exhibited the physical and mental disabilities that would afflict him throughout his life. He was unable to walk until the age of 8, spoke unclearly until much later, and suffered from what contemporary observers described as an enlarged tongue, a severely protruding jaw, and numerous other deformities. His intellectual capacity was severely limited, and he was prone to seizures and episodes of uncontrollable behavior. Despite these obvious impairments, Charles was crowned King of Spain in 1665 at just 4 years old, following the death of his father. His mother, Queen Mariana, acted as regent during his minority, desperately striving to uphold the illusion that her son was fit to govern one of the world's greatest empires. The Spanish court grew increasingly isolated and paranoid, as rival powers began circling like vultures, sensing weakness. The political climate in Europe was unstable. Louis XIV of France was expanding his domains and influence, while the Holy Roman Empire, under Leopold, sought to preserve the balance of power Both monarchs held legitimate claims to the Spanish throne through their Habsburg lineage and awaited Charles II's death without an heir. The issue of Spanish succession had become the most urgent diplomatic concern in Europe. Throughout his reign, Charles II was married twice in desperate bids to produce an heir. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, died mysteriously in 1689, possibly poisoned after, failing to bear children. His second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg was also childless, likely due to Charles's poor physical condition that made fatherhood improbable. By 1700, as Charles entered his final year, the Spanish court was gripped by barely controlled panic. The king's health was rapidly deteriorating. Foreign powers were maneuvering for advantage amid the looming succession crisis, and desperate courtiers resorted to ever more extreme methods to either heal their monarch or secure a clear succession plan before his death. The autumn of 1700 saw a swift acceleration in Charles II's physical decline. Court doctors recorded that the king could hardly walk unaided, his legs too weak to support his gaunt frame. His infamous Habsburg jaw had become so pronounced that he could no longer fully close his mouth, causing constant drooling and rendering his speech almost unintelligible. When he tried to eat, food frequently slipped from his mouth, and swallowing grew increasingly difficult. Contemporary witnesses described Charles's appearance as profoundly disturbing. The Venetian ambassador reported that the king's face was ghostly pale, with large, prominent eyes that seemed to bulge from their sockets. His skin had taken on a waxy, almost translucent hue, and his hair fell out in patches, leaving him partially bald, despite being only in his late 30s. His mental state declined alongside his physical health. He would often sit staring blankly for hours, apparently unaware of his surroundings, before suddenly breaking into bouts of screaming or uncontrollable laughter. Palace servants reported that Charles would sometimes talk to invisible figures, engaging in elaborate dialogues with empty air, or become convinced that shadowy beings only he could perceive were following him. His digestive system had essentially ceased functioning properly. Court documents reveal that Charles suffered from chronic diarrhea, often soiling himself during official ceremonies, much to the horror of visiting dignitaries. He could only retain minimal amounts of nourishment, typically thin broths or diluted wine, and even these simple foods were frequently vomited shortly after consumption. Sleep became elusive for the dying monarch. Palace guards recounted hearing him scream in terror throughout the night, yet upon rushing to his chambers, they would find him alone, cowering in bed and claiming demonic torment. His insomnia grew so severe that he sometimes went days without meaningful rest, accelerating his physical and mental deterioration. The stench emanating from Charles's body became so overwhelming that courtiers would saturate themselves with perfume before entering his presence. Multiple accounts describe a sickly sweet odor of decay that seemed to trail him wherever he went. His breath was reportedly so foul that even his closest advisors struggled to suppress gagging when he spoke directly to them. Perhaps most alarming were the seizures increasingly ravaging his body. These convulsions left him writhing on the floor, eyes rolled back, foam spilling from his mouth as his body shook uncontrollably. Recovery time lengthened with each episode, and observers noted that with every attack, Charles seemed to lose more of his humanity. The royal physicians were utterly perplexed by their patient's condition. They had tried bloodletting, purging, and a variety of herbal remedies, but none could halt Charles's relentless decline toward death. Desperate and depleted of conventional options, they began to suspect that natural remedies alone would be insufficient to save their king. As Charles II's condition worsened throughout the closing months of 1700, the Spanish court increasingly turned to desperate and supernatural explanations for the king's afflictions. The royal doctors, having exhausted their medical expertise, whispered that perhaps his ailments were not of natural origin. Theologians and priests were summoned to examine Charles, many concluding his symptoms aligned with demonic possession. The decision to proceed with exorcism was not taken lightly. The Spanish Inquisition, still a dominant institution in 1700, required extensive documentation and witness testimony before sanctioning such extreme measures. Witnesses were called to testify regarding the king's unusual behaviors, conversations with invisible entities, and his supernatural strength during seizures. To the superstitious minds at court, the evidence was overwhelming. Father Antonio Maricar, the chief exorcist of the court, was called to personally examine the king. His report, preserved in Spanish archives, described Charles as showing all the traditional signs of demonic possession, including speaking in unknown languages, exhibiting superhuman strength, and revealing knowledge of events he could not have possibly witnessed. The priest recommended urgent and intensive exorcism rituals. The first official exorcism was held in the king's private chambers on a cold November evening. Charles was restrained to his bed, while Father Maricar began the long Latin prayers intended to expel evil spirits. The king's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Witnesses described his screams as coming from multiple voices, some high-pitched like a child's, others deep and guttural like an animal's growl. The exorcism sessions quickly turned into public spectacles, with members of the Spanish nobility invited to watch the battle for their sovereign soul. Charles was bound with leather straps as priests sprinkled holy water and burned incense around his writhing body. His reactions grew more violent with each session, as he scratched at his bindings until his wrists bled and bit his own tongue until his mouth filled with blood. These harsh sessions often lasted for hours, with Charles yelling prayers and curses in Spanish, Latin, and what observers claimed were unfamiliar demonic tongues. The physical toll was immense. After each ritual, the king would be left unconscious and barely breathing, his body covered in scratches, bruises, and burns from the repeatedly poured holy water. The Spanish court convinced itself that the exorcisms were effective, citing brief moments of lucidity that Charles occasionally showed after the sessions. During these times, he would sometimes speak more clearly or seem to recognize familiar faces, which the priests interpreted as temporary victories against the demonic forces. However, these improvements were short-lived, and Charles soon fell back into his former state of torment. News of the royal exorcism spread across Europe, causing a stir among foreign courts. The French ambassador wrote to Louis XIV that the Spanish have lost their minds, along with their king. The exorcisms had become more than a medical intervention. They symbolized Spain's desperate effort to sustain its failing empire through supernatural means. The Marquis de Louville, who served unofficially as a French observer at the Spanish court, left one of the most detailed accounts of Charles II's final months. His secret reports to Versailles, found centuries later in French archives, provide a chilling first-hand view of the king's condition. His Catholic Majesty presents a spectacle so pitiful that even his enemies might feel compassion. Louville wrote, "He speaks with great difficulty, his jaw hanging open in a constant grimace that makes his words almost incomprehensible." Louville described witnessing one of the exorcism ceremonies, writing that the scene was more terrifying than any torture chamber he had encountered during his service to the crown. The king's screams echoed through the palace halls, causing servants to cross themselves and murmur prayers for protection. When the priests finally ended their rituals, His Majesty lay motionless, as still as a corpse, his breathing so faint that there was fear he had already passed away. The king's personal physician, Dr. Miguel Fernandez, maintained detailed medical records that remain preserved in the palace archives. His notes meticulously documented the severe physical decline of Charles. The patient's digestive system has stopped functioning normally, he wrote in October, 1700. He cannot retain solid food and suffers from constant bowel movements. His limbs have weakened so much that he must be carried like a child, and his mental faculties seem to fade daily. Dr. Fernandez also expressed increasing frustration with the court's reliance on supernatural treatments. The exorcisms exhaust the patient terribly, he noted. Any brief improvement is quickly undone by the physical trauma these sessions cause. I fear we are hastening his death rather than prolonging his life. However, his professional medical advice was largely ignored as the court's desperation intensified. Maria Anna of Neuburg, Charles's second wife, gave perhaps the most personal account of the king's suffering. In letters to her sister in Germany, she detailed the horror of sharing living quarters with her declining husband. He wakes screaming every night, convinced demons are pulling at his limbs, she wrote. I have asked for separate chambers, as the smell of decay from his body has become unbearable. I fear for my own sanity if I must continue to witness his torment. The Queen's letters also reveal the immense political pressure she endured to somehow heal her husband, or at least obtain a clear declaration of succession from him. The entire court watches my every move, hoping I can succeed where doctors and priests have failed, she wrote. They expect miracles from a wife who can barely bear to be in the same room as her husband. The burden of preserving this dying dynasty rests solely on my shoulders. Palace servants, though rarely literate enough to write, gave oral testimonies, recorded by visiting dignitaries. A chambermaid told the Venetian ambassador that she had seen the king crawling on all fours through palace corridors at night, howling like a wounded beast and clawing the walls until his nails bled. Guards reported finding him kneeling in the palace chapel before the altar, begging God to either heal him or grant him death. The Spanish nobility found themselves caught between their loyalty to the crown and their horror at what their king had become. The Duke of Alba wrote to a friend, "Attending court has become a trial that tests even the strongest constitution. To see majesty reduced to such a state challenges one's faith in the divine right of kings. We uphold the illusion of serving a monarch, but in truth, we are only witnesses to a prolonged death agony." God. By late October 1700, it had become evident to everyone at the Spanish court that Charles II was entering his final weeks. The king was no longer able to leave his bed, and his fleeting moments of awareness were becoming increasingly rare. His body had wasted away so severely that courtiers described him as resembling a living skeleton, with skin stretched taut over protruding bones. The political situation had grown desperate. European powers were openly discussing the division of Spanish territories, and the Habsburg claim to the throne would end with Charles unless he could be persuaded to name a clear heir. The two primary contenders Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou had supporters within the court, resulting in fierce factional rivalries, even as the king lay dying. During his rare lucid intervals, Charles was repeatedly pressured to sign a will naming his successor. Holding a pen had become physically impossible for him, so palace scribes attempted to guide his hand across the paper. The signatures produced were nearly illegible, leading to later disputes over their authenticity. The rival factions took turns visiting the dying monarch, each eager to obtain a deathbed endorsement for their candidate. The exorcisms intensified as death drew near. Father Maréchal and his group of priests kept an almost constant watch at the king's bedside, performing abbreviated rituals whenever Charles showed signs of consciousness. The king's reactions weakened, but the priests interpreted his quieter suffering as proof that the demons were being expelled. Medical treatment was essentially abandoned in favor of spiritual practices. Dr. Fernandez was no longer consulted, and the remaining physicians attending the king were instructed to focus solely on providing comfort. Pain relief was avoided, as the priests believed Charles's suffering was necessary to cleanse the evil spirits from his body. Queen Maria Anna had largely withdrawn from her husband's bedside, unable to witness his final decline. She devoted herself to frantic correspondence with European courts, trying to secure her own position amid the looming succession crisis. Her letters reveal a woman on the brink of a mental collapse-torn between guilt for leaving her dying husband and dread at the thought of his impending death. The palace took on the mood of a death vigil. Servants moved quietly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, and the normal rhythms of court life were suspended. Foreign ambassadors sent daily updates to their governments, each eager to be the first to announce the king's death and the start of the succession crisis that would transform European politics. Charles's final conscious act was reportedly receiving the last rites of the Catholic Church. The ceremony took place in his bedchamber, conducted with the full ceremonial grandeur that Spanish protocol demanded. Although witnesses noted the king showed little awareness of his surroundings, his replies to the priest's questions were barely audible whispers, and he lacked the strength to make the sign of the cross unaided. The last day of Charles II's life, the 1st of November, 1700, began with what palace observers described as an eerie calm. The king, who had been screaming and convulsing for months, lay motionless in his bed, his breathing so shallow that attendants had to lean in close to detect any sign of life. The violent seizures that had plagued him throughout his final weeks had suddenly ceased, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness many interpreted as a sign that the exorcisms had finally worked. Father Maréchal kept vigil beside the royal bed, murmuring prayers and occasionally touching holy relics to the king's forehead. Charles's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved continuously in what the priest interpreted as silent prayers or possibly final conversations with the supernatural forces that had tormented him. The room was thick with burning incense and the soft chanting of Latin from the gathered clergy. As hours passed, members of the Spanish nobility gathered in the antechambers outside the king's room. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, mingled with barely concealed relief. Many had grown exhausted by the months of suffering they had witnessed, and some whispered that death would be a mercy for their tortured monarch. The political ramifications of the king's passing were never far from anyone's mind. Around midday, Charles briefly opened his eyes and appeared to recognize some faces near his bed. Witnesses said he tried to speak, but only managed a few unintelligible sounds. before his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness once more. This brief flicker of awareness would be his last, though his body continued to struggle for several more hours. The moment of death came quietly and almost anticlimactically after months of intense suffering. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, palace doctors noticed that the king's already feeble breathing had stopped completely. They waited several minutes before officially declaring him dead, wary that he might suddenly revive, as he had done on several prior occasions during apparent death episodes. The immediate aftermath was carefully orchestrated according to Spanish royal protocol. The king's body was left untouched for exactly 1 hour before court physicians examined it. Father Marishala said final prayers and declared that the demons had been successfully expelled from the royal remains. The Spanish nobility present at the palace immediately began the intricate process of managing the succession crisis they had long anticipated. Although news of Charles's death was meant to remain confidential until official announcements were ready, word leaked from the palace within hours. By evening, messengers were racing across Europe with the news that would ignite the war of Spanish succession. The major European powers had been preparing for this moment for years, and mobilization orders were issued almost instantly. Queen Maria Anna, who had been absent from her husband's deathbed, was officially informed of his passing by palace officials. Her reaction was reportedly one of visible relief rather than sorrow, though she quickly composed herself to perform her ceremonial duties as the widow of the late king. Her political future, however, remained uncertain, as she held no formal role in the government under Charles's successor. The autopsy of Charles II, conducted on the 3rd of November, 1700 by royal physicians, Dr. Miguel Fernandez and Dr. Antonio Jenga, revealed the full scale of the genetic disaster that had afflicted the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Their detailed report, preserved in the Spanish royal archives, remains a medical document so disturbing that many historians struggle to communicate its contents to modern audiences. Upon opening the king's chest cavity, the physicians discovered what they described as a heart, the size of a child's, fist blackened and shriveled like a piece of leather, left too long in the sun. The heart muscle bore extensive scarring and appeared barely functional during the king's final years. Dr. Fernandez noted, "It is miraculous that this organ sustained life for as long as it did, as it bears little resemblance to a healthy human heart." The king's lungs were found filled with fluid and showed signs of chronic infection. Large portions of lung tissue had effectively rotted away, forming cavities that explained Charles's chronic breathing problems and his inability to speak clearly. The physicians estimated that he had been operating with less than half the normal lung capacity for most of his adult life. Perhaps most startling was the condition of Charles's brain. When the skull was opened, the doctors found a brain so small and damaged that it seemed more suited to a child than an adult man. Large areas of brain tissue showed decay, with numerous cysts and what appeared to be old hemorrhages. The report remarked, "The wonder is not that His Majesty suffered from seizures and mental confusion, but that he retained any rational thought at all." Additionally, the king's digestive system was found to be in complete failure. His stomach was severely ulcerated and contained very little acid, explaining his inability to digest food properly. His intestines showed signs of chronic inflammation and partial blockage, accounting for his ongoing digestive distress. The liver was enlarged and hardened, indicating long-term toxicity, likely caused by the numerous medications he had received throughout his life. The skeletal examination revealed the full scope of the deformities that had afflicted Charles throughout his life. His spine was severely curved, his ribs malformed, and his jaw so distorted that proper eating and speech would have been nearly impossible. Physicians noted that His Majesty's bones resembled those of a man twice his age, brittle and misshapen from a lifetime of suffering. Most disturbing was the discovery of what they called putrefaction of internal organs, while the patient was still alive. Several organs exhibited decay, usually seen only after death, suggesting that parts of Charles's body had literally begun to rot during his final months. This explained the terrible odor that had emanated from him. The autopsy report concluded with a statement famous among medical historians. "It is a miracle that this body sustained life for 39 years. The severity of the deformities and decay indicated that His Majesty's suffering was far worse than anyone outside the court could have imagined. Death must have brought blessed relief from torments no human should endure." Initially, the physicians' findings were kept secret, as they portrayed a horrifying picture of royal suffering that the Spanish court feared would tarnish the monarchy's reputation. However, copies of the report eventually reached other European courts, where they were used to demonstrate the degeneration of the Spanish Habsburg line and justify the impending war over succession. Charles II's death triggered the most significant European conflict since the 30 Years' War, as major powers swiftly began maneuvering to claim parts of the vast Spanish Empire. Within days, both France and Austria mobilized their armies, each asserting legitimate claims to the Spanish throne through their Habsburg lineage. Louis XIV of France acted quickly to support his grandson Philip of Anjou's claim. Based on a will Charles had allegedly signed in his final weeks, naming Philip as his successor. However, the will's legitimacy was immediately contested by Austrian representatives, who argued that Charles had been mentally incompetent and possibly under demonic influence when signing it. The bizarre nature of the king's final months had cast enough doubt on his mental state to provide legal grounds for disputing any documents he had signed. At the same time, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I proclaimed his own son, Archduke Charles, as the rightful king of Spain, citing both Habsburg blood rights and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Charles II's last testament. Leopold contended that the Spanish king's clear mental incapacity, evidenced by years of erratic conduct and alleged demonic possession, invalidated any succession decisions he had made. England and the Dutch Republic, already alarmed by French territorial expansion under Louis XIV, swiftly aligned themselves with the Austrian claim, fearing that a Franco-Spanish union would establish an unbeatable Catholic power bloc. The Protestant nations were especially influenced by reports of the bizarre exorcisms carried out on Charles II, which they used as propaganda to depict Catholic Europe as superstitious and unstable. The Spanish nobility found themselves torn between competing loyalties and pragmatic concerns. Many supported the French candidate, convinced that Louis XIV's military might offer the best defense of Spanish lands. Others backed the Austrian claim, arguing that preserving Habsburg rule was crucial for Spanish identity and independence. The prolonged uncertainty following Charles's death left the Spanish government in disarray, unable to present a united front against foreign interference. Portuguese and Italian territories within the empire quickly declared independence or shifted allegiances. The weakness exposed during Charles II's final illness convinced many regional leaders that central Spanish authority was collapsing, prompting them to secure their own power swiftly. The empire once the world's most dominant, began fragmenting as news of the king's death spread. The economic repercussions were immediate and severe. Spanish colonial trade, already disrupted by months of succession uncertainty, came to a near halt as merchants and colonial officials awaited clarity on which European power would control their regions. The value of Spanish government bonds plummeted on European markets, and several major banking institutions faced bankruptcy due to their heavy exposure to Spanish debt. By spring 1701, what started as a succession dispute had erupted into open warfare across multiple continents. The War of Spanish Succession would rage for more than a decade, ultimately reshaping Europe's power balance and establishing Britain as the dominant naval force. The death of a single genetically impaired king had sparked a global conflict that claimed millions of lives and transformed the modern world. Charles II's death signified not just the end of an individual life, but the fall of one of history's most powerful dynasties. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had ruled vast territories across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa for over 2 centuries, had finally been undone by the genetic consequences of their systematic inbreeding. The dynasty that once claimed the sun never set on its empire had produced a final heir so physically and mentally impaired that he could barely function as a human being, much less as a monarch. Modern genetic studies of Habsburg family records reveal the full extent of the biological disaster that caused Charles II's condition. Researchers have estimated that his genetic makeup was comparable to that of a child born to parents who were full siblings, a degree of inbreeding that virtually ensured severe developmental defects. The Habsburg practice of marrying close relatives, intended to preserve political alliances and concentrate power, had instead created a genetic bottleneck that made the production of healthy heirs nearly impossible. The historical significance of Charles II's death extends far beyond the immediate political consequences. His passing marked the beginning of a new era in European politics, where dynastic claims would increasingly be challenged by considerations of military power, economic interests, and national identity. The bizarre circumstances of his final months, particularly the public exorcisms, became symbols of the superstition and backwardness that Enlightenment thinkers would use to argue for more rational approaches to government and society. The medical aspects of Charles's case have continued to fascinate researchers for centuries. His autopsy report represents one of the earliest detailed medical examinations of the effects of severe inbreeding, providing valuable insights into genetic disorders that wouldn't be fully understood until the development of modern genetics. The horrific physical and mental deterioration he experienced serves as a stark reminder of the biological limits that constrain even the most powerful political institutions. The Spanish Succession War that followed Charles's death reshaped the global balance of power in ways that continue to influence international relations. Today, the conflict established Britain as the dominant naval power, secured French hegemony in continental Europe for a generation, and began the process of Spanish imperial decline. The war also marked the beginning of truly global conflicts, with battles fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and other colonial territories. Perhaps most significantly, the grotesque spectacle of Charles II's final months helped accelerate the intellectual changes that would define the Enlightenment. The image of Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy, reduced to conducting public exorcisms on a dying king, provided powerful ammunition for critics of traditional authority. Philosophers and political theorists would point to the Spanish court's desperate superstitions as evidence that rational thought must replace religious dogma in matters of government. The legacy of Charles II also highlights the human cost of absolute power and dynastic ambition. His life, marked from birth by severe disabilities and chronic suffering, was sacrificed to maintain the fiction of Habsburg legitimacy. The courtiers who surrounded him were more concerned with extracting political advantage from his condition than with providing him with compassionate medical care. His story serves as a reminder that even kings and emperors are ultimately human beings who can suffer and die just like anyone else. The transformation of Charles II from a living person into a historical symbol began almost immediately after his death. Within decades, Enlightenment writers were using his case as an example of the degeneracy of absolute monarchy, while Catholic apologists argued that his suffering represented a form of religious martyrdom. These competing interpretations have continued to evolve, with modern historians attempting to separate the historical facts from centuries of political and religious propaganda. The harrowing final days of Charles II of Spain compel us to face uncomfortable realities about power, suffering, and the human experience that echo through the centuries. Born into the most privileged station imaginable as heir to the world's largest empire, surrounded by boundless wealth and absolute authority, was nevertheless condemned to a life of relentless physical pain and mental anguish caused by the very genetic inheritance that granted him his throne. The response of the Spanish court to Charles's condition exposes the darkest facets of human nature when confronted with mortality and the loss of power. Instead of offering their king compassionate end-of-life care, his courtiers subjected him to increasingly cruel treatments in desperate attempts to extract political gain from his suffering. The public exorcisms, performed as much for political spectacle as for spiritual healing, turned the agony of a dying man into entertainment for the nobility. The medical horrors unveiled by Charles's autopsy remind us that genetic diversity is not merely a biological idea, but an essential prerequisite for human well-being. The Habsburg dynasty's systematic inbreeding, pursued for political rather than biological reasons, led to a genetic catastrophe, culminating in Charles's grotesque physical and mental impairments. His case strongly argues for the critical importance of genetic diversity within human populations. The political fallout from one man's death, a war that lasted over a decade and reshaped the global balance of power, demonstrates how individual frailty can spark monumental historical shifts. Charles's inability to father an heir, directly linked to his genetic defects, triggered a succession crisis that European powers had long anticipated. His death set in motion conflicts that would determine the destiny of nations and empires. Perhaps most importantly, Charles II's story challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization. This was one of Europe's most cultured courts, surrounded by art, knowledge, and refinement. Yet when confronted with their king's illness, they reverted to medieval superstitions and harsh, pseudo-medical rituals. The disparity between their scientific understanding and their actions reveals how swiftly civilized societies can regress to primitive behaviors when faced with death and the collapse of core beliefs. The human dimension of Charles's story must not be overlooked amid political and historical analysis. Despite his titles and privileges, he was ultimately a human being who endured tremendous suffering throughout his brief life. His final months, marked by physical torment, mental confusion, and desperate attempts by those around him to intervene body, a type of suffering that transcends historical eras and social ranks.